Today's episode is brought to you by Alexandra Park BJJ. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a full contact martial art and combat sport that was developed in Brazil in the 20th century. With roots in Judo and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, has been developed and refined into a unique grappling art with the aim to allow a smaller and weaker individual to beat a bigger and stronger opponent with the application of proper technique. Based in Muswell Hill, North London, Alexandra Park BJJ's classes are designed so that you can develop your fitness levels, balance, coordination and flexibility in a no-pressure environment, and to provide the opportunity to start a new sport at a reasonable price. At Alexandra Park BJJ, we aim to be inclusive so that everyone can benefit from this incredible art, not just the athletic or ultra-competitive. To book your free class, head over to alexandraparkbjj.co.uk or email inquiries at alexandraparkbjj.co.uk.
Welcome to Audiobookish, an audiobook review and discussion podcast looking at audiobooks both big and small, as well as radio plays, narrative podcasts, anything audiobook-ish. This podcast may contain spoilers, rants, curse words, mispronunciations of names and places, and more.
Hello everybody, you're listening to Audiobookish. My name is Fahed Rahman and I'm joined as always by Poppy Knight.
Hello.
And today we are going to be discussing Nubia, The Awakening by Omar Epps and Clarence A. Haynes. Poppy, do you want to read out the blurb for Nubia?
Yes, so. For Zuberi, Uzochi and Lencho, Nubia is a mystery. Before they were born, a massive storm destroyed their ancestral homeland, forcing their families to flee across the ocean to New York City. Nubia, a utopic island nation off the coast of West Africa, was no more, and their parents' sorrow was too deep for them to share much of their history beyond the folklore. But New York, ravaged by climate change and class division, is far from a safe haven for refugees, and Nubians live as outcasts, struggling to survive in the constantly flooding lower half of Manhattan, while the rich thrive in the tech-driven sky city known as the Up High. To many, being Nubian means you're fated for a life plagued by difficulties and disrespect, but Zuberi, Uzochi and Lencho are beginning to feel there might be more. Something within them is changing, giving each of them extraordinary powers. Extraordinary and terrifying powers that seem to be tied to the secrets their parents have kept from them. And there are people up high watching, eager to do anything they can to become even more powerful than they already are. Now Zuberi, Uzochi and Lencho will be faced with the choice. Do they use their inheritance to lift their people, or to leave them behind? The fate of their city and their people hangs in the balance.
And it is written by Clarence A. Haynes, a native New Yorker. Clarence served as an associate editor with Doubleday Broadway division of Random House and the imprint Harlem Moon before going to work as a development editor for titles with Amazon Publishing under the imprints 47 North, which specialises in sci-fi and fantasy, and Skyscape, which specialises in YA fiction. He also handles projects for Legacy Lit, a part of Hatchet Book Group. Clarence is the author of the short historical work Legacy of Jim Crow for Penguin Workshop. He lives in Brooklyn and in Berlin. Wherever he goes, he tries to surround himself with books. And the other co-writer is Omar Epps. Omar Epps is an actor and producer who's first introduced the audience as Q in Ernest Dickinson's cult classic Juice. Opposite Tupac Shakur, he's gone on to star in the beloved romance Love and Basketball as Dr. Eric Foreman on the massively popular TV show House, as Jeff Cole in Too Deep, as Isaac Johnson on Shooter, and as Darnell on This Is Us. He is the author of the memoir From Fatherless to Fatherhood, and Nubia, The Awakening is his first novel. And we should just also mention it is narrated by Amir, Abdullah, Emana, Rachelle and Jeorge Bennett Watson. So Poppy, this was one of your picks. Mm-hmm. How did you come across it and what drew you to the title?
Yes, so it was a mix between I had seen it talked about on kind of social media stuff and I saw it when I was browsing through. And the thing that mainly pulled me to it was the fact that Omar Epps had written it. I am a big fan of House. It is a very influential TV show in my life. And yeah, his character of Foreman is in so much of House, and yeah, that show meant a lot to me, so that immediately intrigued me, and I think that was actually a post that I'd seen was, oh, he's writing a novel kind of thing. So yep, as well as, you know, sci-fi and fantasy tick boxes for me. So I thought, definitely want to give it a go.
Okay, cool. So I've only just finished listening to today, so some of my thoughts are going to be a little bit disordered. Usually I kind of like to make a few notes and kind of like figure out how I want to structure the discussion. So let's kind of just start off with like the beginning of the book, which is kind of a big blurb kind of setting out the world in which the book is set in. And I think part of the reason I'm kind of finishing the book so late is kind of like I really struggled to get past that bit of exposition. It's kind of a big bit of exposition before you actually get to the story. Did you struggle with that as well, or was it kind of like yeah, I did a bit. So I'm revisiting my notes because opposite to you, I listened to it a little while ago. But yeah, I have written down here the start's a bit monotone. I think it needed to be kind of more documentary than a list. And so casting my mind back, I think it was quite a lot like sort of between these years this happened, between these years this happened, you know, and it could have been more of a like a documentary thing, more narratively written as to what happened, because I didn't really take it in. I'm not that big on history, and yeah, the stuff I did enjoy in history certainly wasn't just lists of dates and things that happened and blah, blah. And understandably, I don't think the narrator gave much life to it because it was done as more of a dry list. But equally, that's the moment where they needed to give it even more to pull you in. So yeah, I was totally with you. It was kind of like, I wouldn't want it to be too lively because it was dark stuff, you know? There's a flood that completely devastates a homeland and things like that. You know, you wouldn't want him to be really cheery and stuff like that, but more expression might have helped it. Or like I say, that information being presented to us in more of a, here I am setting the scene, than a, here's the first 5 pages of a textbook kind of thing. Yeah, I think, like, for me, maybe a better way of like getting, so this is a sci-fi YA story, so you do need to kind of do a little bit of world building, kind of establishing what the rules of the worlds are, what the societal hierarchy is, kind of where the world of the characters are coming from and stuff. And I just wonder if that information could have been maybe given at the start of each chapter in a certain way. It kind of spaced it out. So in terms of the structure of the audiobook, we've got 2 main narrators, so Amir, Abdullah, and Emana, Rachelle. They take on 2 point of view characters each. So Amir takes on the voices of Uzochi and Lencho, who are 2 cousins and who are the 2 male protagonists for the book. And Emana takes on the point of view chapters of Zuberi and Sandra. So they're not taking on the voices, they narrate point of view chapters from each one of those characters. What do you think about the production decision to kind of split the point of view character chapters the way that they did?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. And I think this is one where you could have made a different decision, but I do quite like the one that they've gone with. So yeah, the fact that, you know, you've got so much third person, there'd be nothing wrong with it being one person reading it, you know? Narrator could give a brilliant performance of all the different characters and all the different perspectives, and that would also have been fine. I certainly think it was good what you say that about the fact that Zuberi and Sandra's are done by one narrator and Uzochi and Lencho by another, and they're more even. I think it would have seemed weirder if it was just Zuberi singled out and then the same male narrator doing the 2 other male characters, you know what I mean? Because then you'd feel like, oh, okay, they're giving a voice to each character, and then, oh wait, no, they're not. They're just singling out the one female one and making it very gendered, like almost as if saying, oh, because there's a female perspective, we have to have a female in there, kind of thing. But I think, yeah, the fact that it was more evenly split doesn't make that as much. And I really enjoyed the performances of both narrators, and I think they brought some really good stuff to both sides of it. So yeah, I think you could have just done one narrator, but I did like the fact that it was multiple, I think, on this one. And then, having a separate voice that was doing those more historical context as well. Not needed, but it was quite nice having a separate person on those as well. What did you think?
Yes. So I kind of had mixed feelings. I really enjoyed the performances of both the performers that did the point of view characters. I did find a little bit confusing, especially with Sandra's and Zuberi's chapters, because I think the performer who does Uzochi and Lencho, he kind of gives those chapters a really different feeling in terms of the way he I felt there's kind of, you really got the sense of like anger and resentment in Lencho's chapters, and that was really easy to kind of delineate or separate which chapters those were. Whereas with Sandra's and Zuberi's chapters, it would take me like 5-10 seconds to kind of realize, oh, this is a Sandra chapter, this is a Zuberi chapter. And I think the other thing that kind of troubled me a little bit is I'm assuming that Sandra and Crazen are both white. Is that a fair assumption?
Well, I find this a very interesting thing about the book, because it's, of course, extremely obvious the parallels between what happens in this book and racism in the US, right? It's very, very clearly that is what it's trying to get at, right?
Yeah.
But the fact that the way it is in the book is it's very specifically about Nubians and non-Nubians. Yeah. That I think, unless I missed something, I think they don't necessarily say what these aristocratic people and the politicians up high, what their race is. Yeah. And I think that was possibly a conscious decision to... it's very much, it's an analogy of, and kind of, I guess, a extrapolation of what... Because this is set in the future, right? Sort of an extrapolation of what is racism now, then is prejudice against Nubians specifically. So I don't know if we know whether they are white or not. They're clearly, they're real world counterparts. Yeah. The assumption is that they're white. But I think in this one, it's the potential that they might not be, but that Nubians specifically are being singled out. Yeah, I mean,
and it does go on to maybe slight spoiler kind of, can't discuss it, but I made the assumption that they were white. So that's kind of, and I think you're probably right. Maybe the characters aren't white. Maybe they would be kind of African Americans or Hispanic or whatever the case may be. But I just felt like, because Zuberi, was obviously kind of Nubian, I just felt like in my head, like her Sandra voice didn't sound white enough to me. So there's kind of maybe, I don't know, that's kind of, maybe I'm making an assumption about the race of the character that I shouldn't be making, but that's kind of it was a slight disconnect for me there. But I don't want to say like the performances were bad. It was just like, for me, that was kind of a slight issue. The other slight problem that I have when there's kind of multiple actors involved is when they are doing the character voices of the other point of view characters. So kind of like when there were, bits where, Uzochi and Zuberi were talking to each other, and that was in like an Uzochi point of view chapter, as opposed to when Uzochi and Zuberi talking in a Zuberi point of view chapter. And it's kind of, I think that's a really tricky production issue when you're doing like an audiobook like that. But I think that's the only other slight thing that I had there. But overall, I think the performances were really good. I think they really kind of captured, especially in the Lencho chapters, kind of like how frustrating Lencho found his situation to be, and he kind of really imbued it with kind of like, you really understood his frustration at the situation that he'd be put in, and kind of the resentment he had towards members of his family as well.
Yeah, no, totally. I think the performances, when you take them in isolation, certainly are really, really good. And like I say, I was worried with how dry I found the beginning bit, but it was only that bit that I thought was dry. I think the rest of it, the performances are really good. And then, exactly, with every dual narration, pretty much that overlap of speaking characters is a really important thing to consider. And involves a lot of forward planning of making sure that people have got, audio to reference of what the other person's done or is going to do. And things like that. That is very difficult, but so important for the final listener experience, definitely. There has been an audiobook that I've listened to where there's a northern character and one narrator did a different accent to the other one from basically a different part of the north. And that did put me off while listening to it. And so, yeah, it's a really important thing to make sure accents are right, and also kind of the rhythms of speech and such like that. And it's the kind of thing where it always makes me wish that audiobooks had the same sort of time and budget allowance to them that films do to get that sort of stuff perfect, and make sure everyone's, rehearsed with each other and have nailed these voices and stuff like that. But yeah, the reality of it is narrators can't fully do that. They can't mimic each other's intonations and stuff as well as an ideal world would be amazing, just on how, quickly audiobooks get turned around. But yeah, it's always something to consider. I feel like I did have some moments where, like you, it didn't feel like it was the right voice, but I certainly don't think that this one derailed me too much, thinking that, oh wait, that sounds nothing like her, or that sounds nothing like him, or anything like that.
I agree with you. So let's talk a little bit about the story. So it's kind of set in the future, and we kind of start the journey with these three main characters, basically Zuberi, Lencho, and Uzochi, and it's very much a coming of age story in terms of Uzochi's got these aspirations to ascend on high through his academic achievement. Zuberi, I can't really remember kind of what her goal at the start of the book was, but it was very much she just wanted to be a strong person that her community could rely on, if I remember correctly. Yeah,
I think it was kind of like, her father training her and her wanting to live up to that sort of like, as a warrior, as a fighter kind of. And making him proud and being like him, I feel like was her sort of motivations.
Yeah, and Lencho is in a gang. He's kind of packed school in, and he's very much sees the gang as his way out of poverty and trying to keep himself safe as well. So I thought it was quite fascinating. They took 3 different examples of people dealing with poverty and how there's different approaches in terms of kind of like trying to scrap your way into survival and stuff like that. How did you feel about that?
Yeah, definitely. I can certainly, at least now you say it, definitely appreciate that it's in some ways 3 people in the same or at least very similar circumstances that, react in completely different ways because they are completely different people. And obviously their family lives being particularly important. So, for example, like I was saying about Zuberi's dad, and then also Lencho's and the abuse that was there, and those kinds of things informing how they respond. And then, their different responses to authority is an interesting thing, and kind of, are they, wanting to go and join the up high? Are they wanting to bring the up high down? All those sorts of stuff that make it really good that it has so many different perspectives. I think obviously this is an interesting story in itself, and has a lot of interesting stuff in it. And I'm sure we'll go on to talk about the kind of different things about powers and whatever. But I agree with you in that I think one of the main assets of this book is the fact that it has those 3 perspectives. Then you have, a 4th perspective of looking down, but I'm more talking about those 3 different perspectives in Lower Manhattan. Like, that's a huge asset of this book because it just widens its scope so much. The fact that it gives 3 different perspectives, and not the way that in a lot of books use perspective to tell you stuff the other character doesn't know, and that kind of use of perspective. It's less that and more about giving you a breadth of the world.
Yeah. Exactly,
and a breadth of characters. And I think that segues into what I think is really important to consider with this book, the fact that it is very clearly the start of a series, right? It's called Nubia the Awakening. This is all about setting the scene, and it is important to consider this as a setting up book rather than a story in itself. Like, it is a good story in itself, but you can really tell that it is building up to more things. It's explaining to you the situation, the characters, the tensions, the history and context, obviously, as we said, and the fantasy sci-fi mechanics that are in place in this series, so that there is still action, there is still a story of this book, but it's gearing you up for, okay, this is what you're letting yourself in for, this is where we're going to take it from.
Yeah, I would agree with it. I wouldn't want that to put anyone off because it is a self-contained story, and even though it sort of ends on a cliffhanger that if you just wanted to read this one or listen to this one book, you'd be very satisfied with your experience, I think.
Yeah. But for those who love, massive series and fantasy epics and stuff like that, then you can tell that this is gearing up to give you something to really get your teeth into.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And just to pick up on one of the points that you kind of mentioned, in a lot of point of view stories, it's kind of like characters maybe talking about information that another character doesn't know about.
Yeah.
One of the things I really appreciated in this book was how you kind of empathize with the way that each one of the characters is approaching the problems that they're facing, because you can completely understand why Lencho has absolutely no interest in doing academic stuff, considering some of his family dynamics, and you can kind of really understand why Uzochi is committed so many resources to becoming academically excellent. So with Uzochi, he kind of, he starts off as a bit this kind of like nerd that goes to these early study sessions. He's kind of like top of the class and all of these sort of things. And I really appreciated that as well. Kind of like it helps you emphasize there's no kind of like one character where you think, well, if I was him, I wouldn't have done what that person was doing in that situation. So I kind of appreciated that.
Yeah. And like the other benefit of having those different perspectives is that it gives more of a range for people to identify with different characters. You know, they can feel more like they are one or the other of them and connect with the world and the story in that way, which is great. Sort of what you just said then made me think of how it's a bit of a grown-up version of the Wizards of Once stuff. The kind of like within the band, you've got the ones that need to be a bit stronger and stand up for themselves more, and then the one who needs to learn from the other by being a bit more caring and sensitive. And it's sort of a more grown-up version of that same theme. Yeah,
so I'm not sure I would have made that connection, but maybe yes, you're right. Let's kind of talk a little bit about the world building. I think the writers did a really great job of like establishing the world, notwithstanding kind of like the big bit of like exposition at the start. I think they did a really great job of establishing, because it's a fantasy story, and fantasy stories do kind of live and die on how invested in the world in which they've created that how invested you can get into it. I think they've done a really wonderful job of creating this kind of like dystopian New York kind of world. Did a really good job of kind of explaining how the social dynamics work as well, and also did quite a good job of kind of explaining some of the technology that the characters are using. So like the people up high have got the the latest holographic technology, where the people in kind of the swamplands where most of the Nubians live now kind of using hand-me-downs, and the way they establish would you say like a police presence kind of around everywhere and stuff like that. How did you what were your kind of favorite elements of the world building that the writers did?
I think the one thing, which is a classic technique but there's a reason for it, is what we touched on, the fact that there are such clear parallels with the current times, and current situation. And that's what in sci-fi and fantasy, the people that say, oh yeah, but it's not real, these books are often way more real than something that's set in the real world, but realistically that's never going to happen, is it? Whereas this is set in a different world, but you feel like all that stuff could happen, right? And then very much the sort of police/military/governmental presence, and how that is distributed among the communities, and what that is used for, and what people claim that is used for versus what it's used for. All those sorts of stuff that are very clearly making commentary on the real world was really good. And I liked how they built the dystopian world, how they sort of set up that this was far in the future, which pulls on those threads, with current times. There was one thing in particular that I found amusing in a bit of a depressing way. The fact that there's a thing at one point about how far into the future from where we are now it was before sexual consent was taught in schools. And I thought that was a clever little droplet of world building for sure, of unfortunately we could really see that being the case, that it's that long until that finally gets implemented. You know what I mean? So little details like that were really, really clever. And then weaving the fantasy in, obviously there's the fact that the children are awakening to the fantasy element of their life at a sort of similar way to what we are doing as well. So we learn about the powers kind of as they do, which is good and is done well. But I liked the way that was teased as well. I liked sort of how Zuberi's power, she's sort of like, what is going on here? And, you know, because it's from her perspective, we get a little bit of, oh, she's seeing this, oh, this is happening, and learn about that. That was really good. I liked that. What did you think?
So I think if there are two elements that I would pick out, one of them is the fact that, the big bad guy in this book is a character called Crazen Saint John, and he kind of lives up high, and the two elements of his kind of like plot to be, I guess, elected mayor of New York City, whatever it is he's got kind of two elements. He's got this private police force, kind of the St. John's Guards, I believe that they're called. And they're kind of like the boots on the ground in the swamp area. We don't really actually see any formal police officers, I guess, from kind of like that have been authorized from like New York City. And I'm really intrigued with the idea of like really rich people employing private security guards to patrol the streets because like the state has abdicated its responsibility in that area. So I really liked the idea that they played around with it. A lot of the book is about economic power and kind of how that can be manipulated one way to support a person's biases or political ambitions. And then one of the other kind of plagues that's affecting the Nubian community are drugs and gangs. And I was really fascinated in the way that they, the role that Crazy St. John had in kind of helping foster kind of like gang violence and the drug trade and stuff like that. So those were my kind of like two favorite elements of world building because, I think those two elements in themselves could probably stand alone and be the basis of like a TV show set now, and kind of using that to set up like a sci-fi problem, I thought was kind of brilliant actually. So I think those are the two elements of the world that I quite enjoyed quite a bit. And you kind of mentioned one of the characters learning about the history as a concept. This is kind of a migrant, a refugee story and how we treat those people and children of kind of like immigrants, what they pick up from their parents. I think one of the other elements that quite intrigued me a bit and kind of made me think was, one of my big regrets actually is how little I talked to my mum and dad about kind of their journey here and their early life in the UK. And so I could kind of understand why the Nubian parents didn't really talk about kind of like back home that much, and kind of how because none of the children realize, none of the people in the world realize that Nubians are capable of these incredible feats of power that they, suddenly become aware of. So that element also kind of worked quite well for me too.
Yeah, no, that's very fair. And having recently edited our episode on the Island of Missing Trees, which I absolutely loved, just to say that again, we talked about this then. That whole thing of the trauma that parents have gone through, deciding therefore that they're not going to talk to their kids about their homeland, their heritage, their background, what they went through. And then, as you say, the curiosity or potentially lack of from those of the younger generation. So it's interesting that those things have come across in both of those stories.
Yes, a kind of curious parallel there. So I think we should maybe talk a little bit about the characters. Do you want to kind of maybe lead off with either Lencho or Zuberi? Because I think we've discussed a little bit, I've discussed a bit about Uzochi, but do you want to maybe talk about one of those two characters?
Yeah, sure. So kind of because you pretty much start off with Zuberi, and she is strong and fierce and wants to be that and wants to, absorb the learning from her dad and kind of follow in his footsteps in sort of a being able to fight, being able to stand up for herself sort of thing, which is very much important about her character. The another part of her character is her friendship with Brianna, who's another person at the school, what she shares with her, how she tries to protect her, all those sorts of things, and her curiosity about what her power is. And also I think her compassion is really important as well. So it was maybe wrong of me to say, that comparison was once that idea that there's a strong one who needs to learn more about caring, because I don't think that is the case, because she does have such compassion. Like when she's first finding out about her power, it's in connection with someone who has been affected by addiction to that futuristic drug elevation, and she definitely has so much sympathy there and a desire to help. And really upset about what's going on around her, but wants to learn more, wants to know more about what she can do and what she is capable of. And when she feels like she can't live up to that, that's hard for her. And that's a really interesting thing that goes through the book, is the
standards she holds herself up to, that she can't quite meet them all the time, and how frustrating she finds that.
Yeah. And that ties definitely to that coming of age kind of thing. You know, I think even if it's not related to, you know, your dad teaching you martial arts or you having a magical power, you know, there is this idea that people want to be stronger and they want to be able to stand up for themselves and they want to be capable. And it's about having the patience that you might not be there yet, but you're going to get there, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I just want to say one quick thing about a frustration I had with the way Zuberi's training was depicted. So so I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's kind of like one of the things that I do. And one of the most important parts of doing a martial art is doing like resistance training against another human being. And all of Zuberi's training sequences was her doing sequences in a park by herself, or hitting a heavy bag by herself. And that, for me, well, if you're just hitting a heavy bag and you're just doing forms in a park and you're not doing any sparring against a resisting opponent, you're going to get your head caved in a real fight when it happens, because like nothing can maybe like the implication is that she does do some sparring with her dad or whatever, but I just feel like I would have loved a sequence in the book where she was training against a training partner, and kind of like, you know, learning that way, kind of showing that would have been a nice way to show that she had skill, that she was beating up a sparring partner or something like that. But I think her training sequences in the book are very much her way of controlling her anger about the situation that she's been put in. But yeah, I can, you know, you was talking about Zuberi's compassion, and one of the characters that sort of brought me back to was Lyra from his Dark Materials, because that's kind of like one of the driving forces within her personality within those books as well. As it's kind of stuff. There was a weird, you know, when you kind of mentioned that compassion, it's like, oh yeah, that's actually a similar kind of sort of, they're both equally kind of driven and stubborn about the way they approach certain problems as well.
And wanting to live up to that expectation.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of like having,
well.
Yeah,
for sure. And I can't say if it was like as you suggest, a lack of knowledge of that sort of training stuff that let that slip through about the sparring against someone, or potentially sort of the impression I get is, maybe this is giving a bit extra credit, but that idea that she wasn't ready, that training wasn't enough, you know what I mean? And yeah, the fact of nothing, as you say, nothing does compare to the actual fight. And certainly in the early stages, that is something that's very important. So yeah.
Yeah. So, and Lencho, do you want to talk maybe a little bit about what you felt about him as a character and how his sections came across as well?
Yeah, definitely. So, because he's put in a very difficult position. He has a bad home life. He's not found school the escape that Uzochi finds it, and gangs have been the way that he is going to get out. And more than that, he's then given an opportunity to ascend to the up high. And you can totally appreciate his conflicting ideas here. The kind of, should I trust these people? Is what I'm doing right? But also, I want to do what's right for me. And those kind of tensions as to who are you willing to throw under the bus for you. And all that stuff is really difficult for him, as he's both just wanting to leave his entire family behind, but then also having that pull with his cousin who he doesn't want to leave behind and he wants to protect. So yeah, his is very much a character that's filled with conflict and wanting to take opportunity where he can, but not knowing if that's the right thing or the wrong thing to do. He was a very compelling character. He was sort of, I think it's partly because him being a bit more mature, that really comes across. And I think that endeared me to him quite a bit because, you know, not to criticise the other two, but yes, something did pull about the fact that he wasn't necessarily more in control of his situation, but maybe he was more thoughtful of it. You know, he wasn't just being taken along for the ride in the discovery as much as the other two. He was making conscious decisions and moves and stuff like that, that A, made the, you know, plot of what he was doing interesting, but also give you real insights as to what are his priorities, what is his character, that when a character's just being taken through what's happening to them, you don't explore as much.
Yeah.
I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, I think it does make a lot of sense. The one point of view character we haven't talked about a lot is Sandra. She's Crazen St. John's daughter. I started feeling about her a little bit one way, and then kind of towards the end of the book felt about her a different way. What did you think about her point of view chapters and kind of her as a character and how she was written and, you know, that sort of thing?
Yeah, exactly. So it's really interesting, isn't it? So the fact that she's the one perspective that we get from the up high, right? Which in some ways reveals to us corruption we didn't know, in some ways confirms to us corruption we assumed was there, and yeah, adds another element to it. And I'm completely with you that my opinion of her changed throughout it. And you've got a similar thing with what I was just talking about Lencho there, in that self-interest thing, and the how much do you want to do the right thing and how much do you want to do the right thing for you. That's interesting. And interesting about how much does the circumstance you're in influence that, maybe, you know? If you have everything, are you more likely to want to keep everything at all costs, as opposed to if you have nothing but the people around you, how willing are you to, and how desperate are you to gain what you can at all costs? So that's kind of an interesting sort of parallel with the conflicts between the two of them. And yeah, you don't really know where you stand. She is against some stuff, but more just intrigued about other stuff. And it's an interesting thing of the book of trying to figure out where on the line or any line she sits, and should she be trusted, and the sort of friendships she makes. Are they going to change her? What's going to happen? There is an interesting character, but not as compelling really as the other three in their story. Probably more because, you know, they're the ones that are in peril more so, that we want things to go well for.
Yeah, we don't really know what the stakes for Sandra are at this stage in the book. And like you mentioned, this is very much the first chapter, in which I assume will be like an ongoing saga. So maybe those, you know, her relationship with her dad and how troubled that seems to be, and kind of sort of it's weirdly abusive. It is, I think it is kind of abusive, the way that he kind of treats her in a lot of ways, and how that will unfold. We don't really know whether what she's doing is to get in the graces of her dad, or is if it's part of a longer plot to maybe usurp him. So that's really, it's kind of murky, it's unclear. It kind of adds a little bit of a Game of Thrones element to the book as well. It's kind of like, okay, what's the short game, what's the long game here, what her priorities and stuff like that. So yeah, so I think that it added, while they weren't my favorite chapters, it certainly added a lot of depth to what the other characters were going through. And if Sandra's chapters weren't there, I think, even though there's not a lot of stakes for Sandra personally at this point in time, her chapters kind of added a lot of stakes to the other characters in the book.
Yeah, and what we were talking about the breadth of the world, that's definitely what that does, right? Because it would certainly be an interesting book if all we had was the perspective of those in Lower Manhattan. Yeah. But it almost, in that sense, makes it less of a story and more of a window into another world, right? That we get that other perspective, you know? If that was shut off from us, then this would be a story about people that's set in this world I've created. Whereas with that, this is the start of a saga in a world, and here's the world for you, which I think is really quite good.
Yeah. So I had a couple of questions about, so that the Nubians, it seems like most of them are going to develop superhuman powers in one form or the other, and it wasn't immediately clear to me, is if you've got this nation of people that live in the world, how they would have been able to keep those powers secret from the rest of the world. And I don't think that's explained in the book. Maybe it'll kind of like come up later, and I think it does hint at the kind of other people around the world may have superhuman powers as well. Right, so I just, what did you think about that was just a little bit of a loophole that kind of like bothered me a little bit. Did that come up on your radar?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that it bothered me, because what I felt about that was that I felt it was a very clear nod to / pull from / inspired by Black Panther, with the sort of ideas of keeping their whole society really as for them. And I sort of, felt that didn't feel like a loophole to me, because it felt like it was a nod to that. It was like we're sort of talking about this kind of situation where it's a nation that has its own assets that it's able to, supernatural sci-fi assets that it's able to prosper from that no one else knows about.
Okay, that kind of makes sense. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that you wanted to kind of pick up on?
Not necessarily. I think we covered quite a lot of it. Yeah, I think it was a really enjoyable listen. I don't think it is going to be my new favourite thing ever, but also I'm fully aware that it is the start of something, and I think it did a lot of that stuff really well. The power stuff is really complicated. The fact that people get different powers means, I guess that's maybe one bit where the world building either maybe isn't that strong or just by nature is more difficult, is for you to understand what are the supernatural rules of this world. We establish what the social rules are, the political rules, all that sort of stuff about this world. I'm not sure we fully get what the supernatural rules of this world are. Whether we're meant to fully yet, because as I say, most of the characters are still just discovering it, I'm not sure. But I think there's more to come from that. I think that requires a bit of attention. I thought it was an interesting book. I thought it was really well performed, even, despite finding the beginning a bit dry. And yeah, I enjoyed it. It was interesting. And I'd just more be intrigued to see where they take it from here.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that it wasn't my favourite thing. I did enjoy my time with it. I'm not sure I'd go out of my way to kind of listen to the second book or read the second book, but if it's kind of available, because I spent quite a lot of money on this audiobook because it wasn't available.
Oh no.
So I think I spent like 30 quid or something like that on it, but I wouldn't go out of my way to spend another 30 quid on like the second book, if that makes sense. If it's kind of like one of your Audible free credits, or it's available for like under £10, I might invest in it. But if it's kind of like, if you need to spend that amount of money on it, I would maybe give it a skip. I think it's an exciting new world that they've created, and I would be kind of curious to see where they take it forward. Again, I agree with you, the point you raised about the supernatural elements of the power, because there is like a religious element in there. Kind of quite a lot of the characters refer to the goddess, and that element's not really explored. And I think that's, especially people in poverty, they do turn to religion quite a lot in terms of finding a place of solace. So I wonder how that's going to be explained. And also, we're using the word supernatural. We don't know if the powers are supernatural in origin. Maybe these Nubians are like mutants, and they're able to, like the X-Men or something like that. And it's actually, their powers are genetically based, but that, it's never established what the source of their powers are. So that's kind of another question that I agree with you, needs to be explored and answered later on in the story. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I guess I was sort of using it in that term of magic / stuff that falls under the fantasy sci-fi realm, but I'm totally with you. Yeah, there is definitely that distinction there that'll be interesting with how it plays out. My thing, sort of pulling on what we've said before, is that I think if you are the type of person who loves fantasy and loves fantasy series and, dedicates themselves to 10-book series, and that is what you love about books and about audiobooks, then there's no reason not to give this one a go, right? It was really enjoyable. It sets up a good world. There's really good social commentary in it, some great performances, some very interesting characters, all the great stuff we've talked about, for sure. But yes, if you don't like big long series, you like more punchier, this is a story, this is what we're going to give you, or at the very least sort of, something then has a sequel after or whatever, or you're not that into sci-fi and fantasy, then fair enough, it might not be the book for you. But if you love that sort of stuff, then add this to your list as a new world to listen to, and let us know in case we don't, or certainly if Fahad doesn't listen to the next ones in future years or whenever they come out. Let us know how it was, and maybe we'll have to come back to it.
I mean, if you're kind of a fan of things like the Hunger Games or Maze Runner, I think this is very much in that wheelhouse, really. So if you're fans of series like that, then I imagine
stuff was I did
dystopian, yeah, kind of dystopian YA sort of thing. This is very much in that wheelhouse, and I think it's really well done as well.
Yeah, that breadth of world that we talked about, as well as that huge asset to it. You really get a feeling of all sorts of different perspectives, and that, you've been dropped into a world rather than you being told someone's story. That is really clever and really enjoyable.
Yeah, cool. So thank you very much for listening, everyone. I'm not too sure what book we're doing next, but we'll let you guys know. If you can please continue to support the podcast by leaving a rating or review on whatever podcast app you're listening to us on, or if you can leave a tip in the tip jar, that would also be really helpful. If you want to contact us, you can contact us on social media at AudioBookishPod on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. I'm in the process of setting up a TikTok account as well, and if you want to contact us by email, it's at audiobookishpod@gmail.com. Thanks, Poppy. Let's say bye.
Bye.